Hello and welcome to the Vailrun Tapes. Every story here is true. It happened to a real person, and they wrote it down or said it out loud, so the rest of us would know. Tonight, I'll share a few of them with you. A lot of you come back here every night, and that means a lot to me. These stories stay with people. That's just what they do. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read all of them. And if you like these stories, a quick like and subscribe really help. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin.
Years ago, I worked in a group home setting with individuals who had mental disabilities. It was not an easy job, but it was meaningful work. The residents depended heavily on structure, routine, and staff support. So every day involved helping with meals, medications, therapy schedules, transportation, emotional situations, and all the little things people outside that world usually never think about. It could be exhausting sometimes, but you also became very close with the residents because you spent so much time around them. The owner of the company had bought 3 houses in a row on the same street and turned them into group homes. Each house had different residents with different conditions and needs, so as staff, we had to learn everybody's personalities, triggers, habits, routines, and behaviors. Some residents needed constant supervision. Some were independent in certain ways. Others struggled with severe emotional or developmental problems. It was one of those jobs where you had to stay alert all the time because even small disruptions could turn into major situations very quickly. The houses themselves were fairly ordinary from the outside. Just regular homes sitting side by side in a quiet neighborhood. During the daytime, everything usually felt normal enough. Residents moving around, television playing somewhere in the background, staff cooking meals, medication schedules taped inside cabinets, people laughing or arguing over little things. But one of the houses always bothered me. I cannot explain exactly why either. Nothing dramatic ever happened there in front of me before this story. No obvious paranormal activity. No terrifying noises. No moving objects. But every single time I entered that house, I felt uncomfortable. It had this strange atmosphere that immediately made me uneasy. Some buildings just feel wrong for reasons you cannot fully explain. The air feels heavier somehow. Silence feels unnatural. Even during the daytime, I never liked being alone there. I mostly kept that feeling to myself because, honestly, it sounded stupid. I considered myself a skeptic at the time. I did not believe in ghosts or haunted houses. If anything, I usually rolled my eyes at stories like that. So I tried convincing myself the bad feeling was just stress, imagination, or me being dramatic. Then, one evening, something happened that completely changed my perspective. That night, most of the staff and residents had gone out for group therapy sessions, leaving me alone at one of the houses to prepare supper. It was pretty quiet because several residents were gone, and I was just focused on cooking and getting things ready before everyone returned. Not long after they left, one of the staff members called me. Apparently someone had forgotten to turn off a crock pot in the house next door before leaving. They asked if I could go over quickly and unplug it. The second they asked, I felt immediate dread. Even now, that sounds ridiculous to me because we are talking about something completely ordinary. Walk into a house, go to the kitchen, turn off a crock pot. Done. But the moment I realized I had to go into that particular house alone at night, my stomach dropped. I almost told them no. But obviously, I could not really refuse over a feeling I could not explain, especially at work. So eventually I agreed and headed next door. The moment I entered the house, The atmosphere hit me immediately again. It was dark inside except for faint light coming through windows from outside streetlights. And for some reason, the house felt freezing cold. Not just cooler than normal, but genuinely cold in this uncomfortable, unnatural way. The kind of cold that immediately raises goosebumps on your skin. I remember standing there for a second, trying to shake off the feeling and telling myself to stop being stupid. So I walked toward the kitchen. The house was quiet enough that I could hear every little sound I made. Footsteps, breathing, the hum of appliances somewhere in the darkness. That kind of silence always feels worse in houses that are supposed to feel lived in. I entered the kitchen, and then I saw him. Standing in the corner was a little boy. At first, my brain honestly could not process what I was looking at. I just froze completely. He looked around 3 years old. He was wearing little overalls and had a bowl haircut. His head was tilted downward slightly, and he seemed focused on something in his hands. I could not immediately tell what he was holding because I was too shocked trying to understand why a small child was standing silently in the corner of a dark, empty house. What scared me most was how real he looked. Not transparent, not shadowy, not some blurry shape in the darkness. He looked like an actual child standing there, physically inside the room. For a second, I genuinely thought maybe one of the residents' family members had left a child there somehow, even though logically that made no sense at all. Then the reality hit me. There should not have been any child in that house. And the second my brain fully understood that, pure panic took over. I remember being completely frozen for a moment before adrenaline suddenly kicked in all at once. Then I turned and practically flew out of the house. I do not even clearly remember shutting the door behind me. I just remember getting out as fast as possible. When I made it back into the other house, I was shaking badly. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. But even then, I did not tell anybody what happened. Partly because I was embarrassed. Partly because I genuinely questioned my own sanity. I kept trying to rationalize it afterward. Maybe stress made me hallucinate. Maybe lighting and shadows created some illusion. Maybe I imagined it because I already disliked that house. I desperately wanted a logical explanation because the alternative terrified me. So I kept quiet. About a week later, one of the staff members from the neighboring house came over, visibly upset. I could tell immediately something was wrong because he looked pale and genuinely shaken. Apparently, he was talking seriously about quitting his job. At first, I assumed maybe something happened with one of the residents. Instead, I overheard him speaking with the supervisor about the house. He said he had researched the property. Then he explained that years earlier, around 10 years before we worked there, the house had caught fire. And a little boy had died in that fire. The second he said that, every hair on my body stood up. I immediately walked into the room because suddenly my experience the week before came rushing back all at once. A staff member had printed out a copy of an old news article about the fire. And when I looked down at the photograph included with the article, I felt all the blood drain out of my face. It was him. The exact same little boy I had seen standing in the kitchen. Same bowl haircut. Same age. Same face. I remember physically going cold looking at that picture because until that exact moment, part of me still believed I had imagined the whole thing somehow. But seeing the photograph destroyed every explanation I had been clinging to. The other staff member then started talking about his own experiences in the house. Strange things happening. Feelings of being watched. Odd sounds. Moments that made him uncomfortable enough to research the property history in the first place. And sitting there listening to him, I realized I was not the only person who felt something wrong in that house. That honestly scared me more than seeing the boy itself, because one strange experience can maybe be explained away. Stress, imagination, poor lighting, exhaustion. But when multiple people independently experience things connected to the same place, it becomes much harder psychologically to dismiss. I remember staring at the newspaper photograph for a long time afterward. The thing that haunted me most was how calm the little boy looked when I saw him. He was not screaming. He was not threatening. He was not some monstrous horror movie ghost. He was just standing there quietly, looking down at something in his hands like a normal child. That somehow made it sadder and scarier at the same time. Over the years, I have thought about that experience more times than I can count. Even now, I still cannot fully explain it rationally. Maybe there is some psychological explanation. Maybe memory and fear can create things that feel impossibly real. Maybe coincidence played a role somehow. But deep down, the moment I saw that photograph, something inside me changed permanently. Before that night, I was a complete skeptic. Afterward, I could not honestly say I was anymore, because I know what I saw in that kitchen. And I know the face staring back at me from that old newspaper article was the same little boy standing silently in the corner of that freezing dark house. I've been a pretty chubby person for most of my life. Not huge or anything extreme, but definitely overweight enough that it became a constant topic growing up. My parents tried helping me lose weight several times over the years. Diets, exercise plans, encouraging me to be more active, all the usual stuff parents do when they worry about their kids' health. The problem, honestly, was never really them. It was me. I just never had much motivation. I was physically lazy, liked staying inside, and every attempt to get healthier usually lasted a couple weeks before I drifted back into old habits. This part matters because one of those attempts ended up leading to one of the strangest experiences of my life. Now, before getting into it, there's another thing about me that's important too. I'm not really religious, at least not in the serious, committed sense. I was baptized Catholic when I was young, and later also baptized into the Mormon Church because of family-related reasons and circumstances at the time. But as I grew older, I became more skeptical than faithful. I wouldn't call myself an atheist because I don't completely reject the possibility of supernatural things or spirituality. But I'm definitely not deeply religious either. I guess agnostic skeptic is probably the closest description. That said, when you grow up exposed to religion as a kid, certain ideas stick in your brain whether you want them to or not. Children absorb everything around them like sponges. Stories about angels, spirits, demons, miracles, guardian figures, souls, all of that gets tucked somewhere deep in your mind. Even if you stop actively believing later, those ideas stay hidden in the background of your thinking. And honestly, I've had a few weird experiences in life that sometimes make me wonder whether there really are things out there we don't fully understand. This story is probably the strangest one. I was around 14 years old at the time. My family lived a couple blocks away from a small park. It wasn't some huge fancy place either, just a regular neighborhood park with jogging paths, benches, patches of grass, and a few scattered trees. Since I spent most of my time sitting around doing absolutely nothing active, my parents eventually started forcing me to jog there every day. At first, I hated it. I'd drag myself there reluctantly, do a few miserable laps, sweat like crazy, and head back home annoyed. But after a while, it became routine. Not enjoyable exactly, but familiar enough that I stopped complaining as much. One particular day, I went jogging around 4 in the afternoon. That probably doesn't sound strange unless you understand how things work where I live. Around that hour, especially in hotter areas, people often stay indoors resting or napping. Streets get weirdly empty. Public spaces become quiet. Add in the fact my country is not exactly the safest place in the world, and honestly, it probably was not the smartest time to go jogging alone. It was common knowledge that robberies happened regularly, especially from people riding motorcycles looking for easy targets. But at 14, I honestly didn't think much about danger. I was more annoyed about jogging than worried about getting mugged. So I went anyway. When I arrived at the park, it was mostly empty. Quiet enough that I remember noticing it. No families, no kids playing, no old people sitting on benches. Just the occasional distant sound of traffic and wind moving through trees. I started jogging my usual route around the park. Nothing unusual happened at first. I was probably around my second lap when suddenly this kid appeared near the middle area of the park. To this day, I still can't fully explain where he came from. Logically, he probably had already been there, and I simply hadn't noticed him. That's the most reasonable explanation. But in my memory, the park felt empty before that moment. Then suddenly, there he was, jogging alongside me casually, like we already knew each other. He looked around my age, maybe a little older. And unlike most awkward random encounters between teenagers, conversation with him felt strangely natural immediately. He started jogging beside me and making small talk. We exchanged names, ages, and the usual casual stuff people ask when they meet unexpectedly. He mentioned he was a year older than me. We talked about the neighborhood, the park, school, random everyday things. Nothing creepy. Nothing threatening. Honestly, he was just a really chill guy. At one point, the topic of where we lived came up naturally, because I mentioned I came to that park often. He explained he didn't actually live nearby permanently, but was visiting relatives who lived about half a block away from the park. That detail became very important later. I remember feeling oddly comfortable around him very quickly. Usually I was pretty awkward socially back then, especially with strangers, but conversation with him flowed effortlessly. We jogged together for several laps, just talking casually, like two friends who had known each other longer than 30 minutes. There was something calm about him, too. Not overly energetic, not fake friendly, just relaxed. Eventually, he told me he had to leave. Before going, he mentioned that he'd only be staying with his relatives a short time longer and suggested I stop by the house sometime in the next few days if I wanted to hang out again before he went home. I agreed. Then he left. And honestly, at the time, the interaction felt completely ordinary. A little unusual, maybe, because random teenagers don't always strike up conversations that easily, but nothing paranormal or creepy. Just a weirdly pleasant encounter during an otherwise boring jogging session. 2 days later, I decided to actually visit him. That's when things stopped making sense. I remembered the address area he mentioned clearly enough. It wasn't vague in my head at all. I walked through the neighborhood until I found the house I believed he pointed out. Then I knocked. An older woman answered. I asked about the kid, and she looked completely confused. Not suspicious at first, just genuinely confused. She told me nobody by that name lived there or was visiting. At first, I assumed I must have mixed up the address somehow. Easy mistake, right? So I apologized and tried nearby houses instead. Same result. Nobody knew him. Nobody recognized the description. Nobody had relatives visiting that matched him. At that point, I started second-guessing myself hard. Maybe I misunderstood the house location during our conversation. Maybe I remembered wrong. Maybe he lied about where he was staying for some random reason. So I kept looking. And when I say I checked every house in that area, I genuinely mean it. I walked around that neighborhood, knocking on doors and awkwardly asking people if they knew the kid I described. Looking back now, I probably seemed insane. But nobody recognized it. Not one person. Eventually, I gave up because, honestly, what else could I do? I went home feeling confused and embarrassed, mostly convincing myself the kid probably gave me fake information and forgot about it afterward. Life moved on. And weirdly enough, after that, I never thought about him again. Not seriously, anyway. The memory just faded into one of those random, strange moments from childhood that don't make much sense but don't seem important enough to obsess over either. Then, a couple of years later, something happened that brought the whole thing crashing back into my mind instantly. During high school, I attended a military school. 3 times a year, we had outdoor military camping trips and survival exercises. They were usually exhausting. Long hikes, drills, sleeping outside, practical exercises. All the typical military school stuff designed to toughen students up. I was around 16 during one of these trips. We were out in a large, grassy outdoor area during training exercises when suddenly I looked off into the distance and I saw him, the exact same kid, standing several meters away in the tall grass. The second I saw his face, recognition hit immediately. It was instant. Not vague familiarity. Not, he kind of looks similar. It was absolutely the same person from the park years earlier. And the weirdest part? I had not thought about him in years before that exact second. Not once. No dreams, no memories. Nothing. Then suddenly, there he was, standing in the middle of nowhere during military training. I only saw him briefly, maybe a second or two at most. Then he was gone. Not dramatically vanished into thin air or anything supernatural like that. I just lost sight of him almost immediately when attention shifted during the exercise. But I remember freezing in place for a moment, trying to process what I had just seen. Because it made absolutely no sense. Why there? Why then? And how had he not visibly aged much at all in my memory? The whole thing genuinely unsettled me. For the rest of the trip, I kept scanning crowds and distant areas, half expecting to see him again. But I never did. And honestly, I still do not know what to make of any of it even now. Part of me still tries forcing a rational explanation onto the experience. Maybe the original encounter was ordinary, and the second sighting was just somebody who happened to resemble him closely. Human memory is weird. Brains connect patterns all the time. Maybe I unconsciously exaggerated similarities afterward because the first experience already carried mystery around it. But another part of me cannot fully dismiss how strange the whole thing felt emotionally. The park being empty, him appearing suddenly, how naturally we connected, nobody knowing him afterward. Then seeing him again years later in the middle of tall grass during military exercises after never once thinking about him in between. It felt wrong in a way that's hard to explain. Not evil exactly, just deeply strange. And honestly, what creeps me out most is that I still remember his face clearly even after all these years, despite only spending maybe half an hour with him, total, across my entire life. Sometimes I wonder whether he was even real in the normal sense at all. And if he was, why did it feel like he appeared briefly in my life twice and then disappeared completely both times, like he was never supposed to stay long in the first place? I am a 911 dispatcher. And there is one night that still stays in my mind even after all these years. It started like any other quiet night shift. The kind where the phones barely ring and most of the radio traffic is just routine check-ins. It was around 3 in the morning, that strange time when everything feels still, almost too quiet, like the whole world is holding its breath. I remember sitting there with my headset on, scrolling through notes, half expecting nothing serious to happen until morning. Then everything changed in a matter of seconds. The first call came in about a major highway accident. At first, the information was unclear. Someone reported a large truck had crashed into a smaller vehicle, and there was smoke visible from the distance. The caller sounded panicked and kept repeating that it looked bad, really bad. In this job, you learn quickly that people's emotions can make situations sound worse than they are. But something in their voice made me sit up straight. I immediately alerted dispatch channels and started sending units. Within moments, more calls started coming in from different drivers on the highway. Each one added more detail, and none of it was good. An 18-wheeler had apparently drifted across lanes, likely due to the driver falling asleep, and slammed directly into a white box-style delivery truck. That truck was carrying 3 people inside. The impact was severe enough that both vehicles were badly damaged, and there were early signs of fire risk. We escalated it fast. Fire units, multiple police departments, highway patrol, emergency medical services, and even air support were all dispatched. When I say the response was large, I mean it was massive. It felt like we were sending half the emergency system in the area to one location. Within a short time, I could hear multiple units checking in, all heading toward the crash site. As I continued coordinating traffic, more updates came in. The first officers on scene confirmed that the box truck had been hit hard, but something unexpected had already happened before emergency services fully arrived. According to witnesses, a person had shown up at the scene almost immediately after the crash. No one could clearly explain who he was or where he came from, but several people described seeing him pull the 3 men out of the burning or damaged box truck before it could fully ignite or explode. That detail immediately changed everything. If those 3 people had been trapped inside when the fire fully spread, the outcome would have been completely different. But somehow, this unknown man had gotten them out just in time. By the time fire crews arrived, the victims were already outside the vehicle and away from immediate danger. They were injured, yes, but alive. The firefighters focused on stabilizing them and moving them further away from the wreck, while also dealing with the growing risk of explosion from fuel and damaged equipment. The scene was chaos in the way only a major highway accident can be. I remember hearing it over the radio clearly. There were so many units responding that the radio traffic almost never went silent. Police were securing lanes, firefighters were controlling the fire risk, paramedics were treating injuries, and highway patrol was trying to manage the growing backup of vehicles that stretched far down the road. At one point, it was estimated that nearly 200 emergency personnel were either on scene or being redirected there. Helicopters were circling overhead. The sound of urgency in every voice over the radio made it clear that this was not just another accident. This was one of those events that pulls in every available resource because every second matters. Through all of this, I stayed in communication with one of the firefighters who was directly involved in securing the victims. He had one of the injured men with him, and he was trying to move him through the crowded scene toward the medical staging area, where paramedics were waiting. The firefighter was giving me updates, and I was logging everything while relaying information to other units. At one point, he mentioned something unusual. He said the man who had pulled the victims out of the truck was still unseen, and that they were trying to get his statement. According to him, this man had been standing nearby, calm but clearly in shock, as if he was processing what had just happened. The firefighter said he was personally holding onto the man's shirt because the area was so crowded and chaotic. There were flashing lights everywhere, people running, shouting, moving equipment, and it was easy to lose someone in that kind of environment. The firefighter told me he was trying to guide this man toward a quieter area so they could get a proper statement. That information was important because witnesses like that can make a huge difference in understanding exactly what happened in a crash of that scale. I remember acknowledging him over the radio and asking him to keep me updated. Then, a few moments later, something strange happened. The firefighter came back on the radio sounding confused. He said he had just turned his head for a second, maybe to speak to another crew member or check on the injured patient. And when he looked back, the man was gone. Not just moved away, not walking off into the crowd, but completely gone. He said he still had hold of the man's shirt just seconds before, and then suddenly there was nothing in his hand. At first, I thought maybe the man had been taken by another unit or moved to a different area for questioning. That would have been the normal explanation in a scene that crowded. But the firefighter said something that made everything feel different. He said he had asked around immediately, checked nearby crews, looked in both directions of the highway, and even tried calling out for him. No one had seen the man leave. No one remembered taking him. And more importantly, no one seemed to know who he was. This is where the situation started to shift from unusual to deeply unsettling. I remember asking for clarification over the radio, trying to make sure nothing was misunderstood. The firefighter repeated himself. He described the man again in detail, what he was wearing, where he was standing, and how he had been right there in front of him. He said it wasn't possible, that he had just slipped away in the crowd because he had been physically holding him moments before. At this point, I instructed units on scene to do a quick sweep of the immediate area. It was still an active scene, but the most urgent fire risk had been controlled, so there was a brief window where resources could be shifted. Officers started checking nearby vehicles, med tents, and perimeter zones. Other firefighters asked around among themselves. Paramedics checked the staging area where injured victims were being treated. There was no sign of him. What made it even more confusing was that no one could identify him as part of any official response team. He was not a firefighter, not police, not EMS, and not a recorded witness in any of the early reports. Yet multiple people clearly remembered seeing someone helping at the crash, pulling victims out before emergency crews fully arrived. As the search continued, I could feel the tone on the radio slowly change. What had started as a controlled emergency response was now becoming something else, layered on top of it, something that none of us could easily explain. Officers were now not just focused on the crash itself, but also trying to locate this missing man who had possibly saved 3 lives. We made the decision to temporarily pause non-essential movement on the scene so that a more focused search could be conducted. Helicopters adjusted their flight patterns slightly, scanning the surrounding highway and nearby fields. Ground units checked the tree lines, service roads, and underpasses. Even nearby traffic was reviewed in case someone had left the scene on foot. But there was nothing. The 3 victims from the box truck were eventually stabilized and transported to hospital. Miraculously, they survived, and all reports confirmed that without immediate extraction from the vehicle, they likely would not have made it. That part was clear and consistent across all reports. Someone had gotten them out at exactly the right time, but no one could confirm who. After a while, the intensity of the search started to wind down. Not because we found answers, but because there simply was no more ground to cover. Every unit that had been on scene was asked again if they had seen the man leave, speak to anyone, or enter any vehicle. The answer was always the same: no. Even the firefighter who had been holding on to him was visibly shaken, according to later reports. He kept repeating that he had physically felt the man there just seconds before, that there was no gap in time where he could have walked away unnoticed. He wasn't describing it like a misunderstanding. He was describing it like something that should not have been possible. Eventually, the search was called off. The official report focused on the accident itself, the cause, the response time, and the successful rescue of the 3 victims. From a procedural standpoint, it was considered a major emergency response with a positive outcome in terms of lives saved. But for those of us who were directly involved in the radio traffic that night, there was an unanswered piece that never fully settled. The man who saved those 3 lives was never identified. No footage, no witness statement, no record of him arriving or leaving. Nothing ever matched him to a known person or responder in the area. Even after the scene cleared and things went back to normal, I remember sitting at my console thinking about how strange it all was. In this job, you get used to chaos, you get used to tragedy, and you get used to outcomes that make sense in a harsh way. But every once in a while, something happens that doesn't fit into any of those categories. That night was one of those times. To this day, I still think about how a man appeared in the middle of one of the biggest emergency scenes I had ever worked, helped save 3 lives, and then vanished without a trace in the middle of hundreds of trained responders. No explanation ever really made sense, and no follow-up ever gave closure. It remains one of the few incidents in my career where the official outcome and what I experienced in real time feel like they belong to 2 completely different stories. A guy once knocked on our door in the middle of a quiet afternoon. It wasn't someone we knew, and for a moment my mom hesitated before opening it. He looked like a journalist, or at least that's what he said. He was carrying a notebook and had that careful, observant way of standing like he was always ready to write something down. He introduced himself politely and said he was doing a story about the area, specifically about an old train crash that had happened not too far from our house. He said the crash had been one of the worst in the region's history, and people in town still talked about it sometimes. My mom listened, but didn't say much at first. We didn't really know anything about a train crash being connected to where we lived. Then he explained why he was at our door. He said our house was the closest residential property to the crash site. He told us that many years ago, a passenger train had derailed and caught fire during the accident. It had been a terrible scene, with passengers trapped inside and smoke filling the cars. According to old reports, the train conductor had stayed behind, going back into the burning train multiple times, trying to help passengers escape. In the end, he never made it out. He died inside while trying to save others. The journalist said there were still stories in the local area about strange things happening near the crash site. People had talked about feeling uneasy, hearing things at night, and seeing lights or shadows near the tracks, long after the railway line had been repaired. He wasn't saying it like he fully believed it himself, but he also didn't completely dismiss it. It felt like he was gathering opinions, trying to understand what people thought about the place today. Then he said something that made my mom go quiet. He said that out of all the houses nearby, ours was the closest one to where the conductor had died. At first, my mom just nodded politely, like she wasn't sure how to respond. The journalist asked if anyone had ever noticed anything unusual in the house. He said sometimes old incidents like that can leave behind stories, feelings, or experiences that people can't easily explain. He didn't push too hard, but he clearly wanted an answer. My mom finally told him she didn't know anything about the house being connected to that crash when we moved in. She said my dad had bought the place years earlier, and only later mentioned that he knew about the accident, but didn't really believe in the idea that a place could be haunted. He thought it was just history, nothing more. The journalist thanked her and left after a few more questions, but the conversation stayed in my mom's mind long after he was gone. I remember her standing near the kitchen afterward, thinking quietly, not really saying anything at first. It wasn't fear in her face yet, more like uncertainty, like she was trying to connect things she had never thought about before. That night, she brought it up to my dad. My dad didn't deny anything. He admitted he had heard about the train crash before buying the house. People in the area had mentioned it casually, like part of local history. But he said he didn't take it seriously. He didn't believe a house could be affected by something that happened so far away, especially something that was just an accident from the past. To him, it was just another old story people told. But my mom was different. After that journalist visit, she started paying attention to everything in the house. Things she used to ignore suddenly felt different. At first, it was small things. Doors that didn't stay closed properly, even when they were locked. We would close a door fully, and later find it slightly open again, even though no one had gone near it. My mom would ask if anyone had touched it, and we would all say no. Sometimes she would check it herself, close it firmly, and still find it open later. Then there were the sounds. At night, when the house was quiet, there were moments when you could hear footsteps in the hallway. Not loud or fast, just slow steps, like someone walking from one end of the house to the other. At first, my dad said it was probably the house settling or pipes making noise. But the footsteps didn't sound like pipes or wood shifting. They sounded like actual movement, like someone walking with purpose. Sometimes it would happen when everyone was in one room together. We would be sitting in the living room watching TV or talking, and we would hear footsteps outside the room, in the hallway, even though nobody had left the room. When we checked, there would be nothing there. The hallway would be empty, silent, just like it always was. Over time, the feeling of the house changed too. It's hard to explain, but there was a sense of being watched when you were alone in certain parts of the house. It wasn't constant, and it wasn't something we talked about at first. But slowly, different members of the family started noticing it separately. My mom would mention feeling uneasy in the kitchen at night. My dad said he sometimes felt like he wasn't alone when he was in the hallway late in the evening. I even felt it myself, especially when passing by certain rooms. The strange thing was that it never felt aggressive or threatening. It didn't feel like something trying to hurt us. It felt more like awareness, like something was present but not fully interacting with us. That didn't make it any less uncomfortable, though. My mom started changing small habits because of it. She would double-check doors before going to bed. She would avoid walking through certain parts of the house alone at night. Sometimes she would even leave lights on in hallways that she used to keep dark. At first, my dad tried to calm her down and told her she was imagining things. But even he started noticing things he couldn't easily explain. One night, he told us he heard a door shut by itself. It wasn't a draft or wind because all the windows were closed. He said he was sitting in the living room and heard a clear click and then the sound of a door closing somewhere in the house. He got up and checked every room, but everything was as it should be. No one had moved. No door was open or closed differently than before. After that, even he stopped dismissing everything so easily. The journalist visit seemed to have changed something in my mom especially. It wasn't just fear. It was a growing need to understand what was going on. She started thinking more about the train crash, about the conductor who had gone back into the burning train to save passengers. The idea of someone dying in such a way stayed in her mind. She would sometimes mention it quietly, like she was trying to make sense of it all. A few weeks passed like this, with small, strange events happening here and there, nothing dramatic, but enough to keep tension in the house. Then things started to feel more consistent. It wasn't just random anymore. It felt like the house had a rhythm of its own. Lights would flicker slightly, even after we replaced bulbs. Objects would sometimes be moved a few inches from where we left them, not enough to be obvious at first, but enough that you would notice if you paid attention. My mom once placed keys on the kitchen counter, turned around to grab something, and when she turned back, they were no longer where she put them. They were on the other side of the counter. No one else had been in the room. At night, the footsteps became more noticeable. Not every night, but often enough that we started listening for them without meaning to. It became something we were aware of in the background of our lives. My mom started sleeping less peacefully. She would wake up during the night and sit quietly, listening. Sometimes she would wake my dad and ask if he heard anything, and sometimes he did. Sometimes he didn't. But the fact that it was happening more often made it harder to ignore. Eventually, the breaking point wasn't a single big event. It was the buildup of everything combined. One evening, my mom said she didn't want to stay in the house anymore. She said she couldn't explain everything clearly, but she didn't feel comfortable there anymore. She said the journalist's visit had opened something in her mind, and everything that followed had made it worse instead of better. My dad tried to reason with her, but she was firm. She started looking for new houses almost immediately after that. I remember the days that followed felt different. It was like the house itself knew something had changed in us. My mom stopped treating it like a normal home. She would pack things slowly, quietly, as if she was preparing to leave something behind that she didn't fully understand. My dad didn't argue much anymore, even though he never fully admitted to believing anything supernatural was happening. He also stopped denying what we had experienced. There was just too much that didn't make sense to ignore completely. We eventually moved out. Even after leaving, the memories didn't fully leave with us. My mom would still sometimes talk about the footsteps, the doors, and the feelings she had in that house. She would mention how it all seemed to start after the journalist came, as if that conversation had triggered something in her awareness that she couldn't turn off again. To this day, I don't know what exactly happened in that house. I don't know if it was connected to the train crash or the conductor or just coincidence mixed with fear and timing. All I know is that before that journalist knocked on our door, the house felt normal to us. And after that day, it never felt the same again. When Japan occupied Taiwan, the first years were filled with fear, violence, and resistance. The island was not quiet, and the people living there did not simply accept the new rulers without a fight. Many Chinese communities resisted the occupation, and according to the story that was passed down, the Japanese answered that resistance with terrible force. It was said that hundreds of thousands of Chinese people were killed during those early years, out of a population of only a few million. Whether people heard the exact number from elders, old accounts, or local memory, the meaning behind it was always the same. The occupation began with blood, and everyone on the island understood that the Japanese army was willing to do almost anything to control Taiwan. But even after crushing many of the Chinese uprisings, there were still people the Japanese could not easily defeat. Deep in the mountains lived the Aboriginal tribes, and among them were the Tayal, a people with their own customs, their own lands, and their own fierce way of life. The Japanese could take towns, roads, ports, and government offices, but the mountains were different. The mountains belonged to people who knew every path, every ridge, every hidden trail, and every place where a soldier could disappear before anyone knew where the attack had come from. The Tayal were not fighting like a regular army. They did not line up in open fields or wait behind walls. They moved through forests, climbed steep slopes, and struck from places the Japanese soldiers did not understand. For the soldiers sent into those mountains, it must have felt like fighting the land itself. One group in particular became a serious problem for the Japanese. They were Tayal from Slamal, near the high mountain area later known around Lishan. There were not many of them, only a few hundred people, by the telling of the story, but they held out against thousands of Japanese soldiers for years. That was the part that always made the story feel almost impossible. A small mountain community, outnumbered many times over, managed to resist a modern army that had weapons, supplies, organization, and the full power of an empire behind it. Yet the Tayal had something the Japanese did not have. They had the mountains, they had patience, they had knowledge passed down through generations, they had pride, and they had no desire to bow to strangers who came into their land and demanded obedience. For years, the Japanese tried to break them. Soldiers were sent into the mountains, but the land worked against them. The weather was harsh. The paths were dangerous. The forests were thick. The Tayal knew how to disappear, how to wait, and how to strike when the enemy was weak or careless. Every attempt to force them into surrender only seemed to prove how difficult it would be to truly conquer them. The Japanese could send more soldiers, but numbers did not solve everything. A man who does not know the mountain is always at a disadvantage against a man who was born there. After enough losses, frustration, and humiliation, the Japanese decided to change their approach. Instead of fighting openly, they came with words of peace. They said they had had enough. They said they wanted the conflict to end. They said they wanted to be friends. To outsiders, that might have sounded like a reasonable thing, maybe even a hopeful thing. After years of violence, who would not want peace? But in a story like this, that offer carries a heavy darkness from the beginning, because the listener already knows that the peace being offered was not honest. For the Tayal, reconciliation was not something to reject lightly. Their culture valued certain rules of respect, honor, and relationship between people. When an enemy came forward and offered peace, it was not simply a political trick in their eyes. It had meaning. It carried a kind of weight. To refuse an offer of reconciliation could be seen as wrong, or at least deeply serious. So when the Japanese came saying they wanted friendship, the Tayal accepted it. They believed, or at least allowed themselves to believe, that the fighting might finally be over. After years of bloodshed, there was a chance that their people could rest, gather, eat, and maybe live without always waiting for the next attack. The Japanese arranged a great feast. It was supposed to be a celebration of peace, a meal that marked the end of fighting. People came together, probably with mixed feelings. Some may have been cautious, some may have been hopeful. Some may have trusted the offer because their customs told them that reconciliation should be respected. There may have been elders there, warriors, women, children, and families who had spent years living under the shadow of war. After so much fear, the sight of food and a gathering may have felt like the first breath after being held underwater for too long. But the feast was a trap. Once the Tayal were inside, the Japanese sealed the place. The doors were nailed shut, so no one could escape. Then they set the building on fire. It is hard to imagine the horror of those moments. One moment, people were gathered for a meal that was supposed to bring peace. The next, smoke and flames began filling the room. People would have rushed toward the doors only to find them blocked. They would have pushed, shouted, screamed, and tried to break their way out. Parents would have grabbed children. Warriors who had survived years of fighting in the mountains would suddenly have found themselves trapped not by soldiers in battle, but by betrayal. The very people who had offered friendship had turned that offer into a death sentence. The fire would have spread quickly. Smoke would have burned their lungs. The heat would have forced everyone back from the walls and doors. In a battle, a person can run, hide, fight, or die with a weapon in hand. But here, there was no room to fight. No open ground, no mountain trail, no chance to use the skills that had kept them alive for so long. The Japanese had chosen a method that removed the strength of the Tayal completely. They did not defeat them in the forest. They did not defeat them in fair combat. They lured them in with peace and killed them while they were trapped. Almost everyone inside died. A few survived only because they had not been there when the feast happened. They were away hunting in the mountains. At first, that must have seemed like luck, but it soon became its own kind of nightmare. Imagine returning from a hunt and finding out that your people, your relatives, your friends, your whole community, had been burned alive in a place where they had gathered under the promise of peace. The survivors would have carried that news like a wound that could never close. They had not escaped because they were stronger or faster. They had escaped only because they were somewhere else at the time. But even those few hunters were not safe for long. The Japanese captured them. And then, according to the story, they did something meant not only to kill them, but to send a message to every other Tayal community in the mountains. They called Tayal people from other places and forced them to watch. This was not just execution. It was terror made public. It was a warning. The Japanese wanted the other tribes to see what happened to those who resisted. The captured hunters were boiled alive in oil. The cruelty of that image is difficult to sit with. It was not enough for the Japanese to kill them quickly. It was not enough that their families had already been burned to death. The survivors were made into an example. Their suffering turned into a display for others. The people forced to watch would have understood exactly what the Japanese were saying without needing many words. This is what will happen if you fight us. This is what will happen if you refuse us. This is what will happen if you believe your mountains can protect you forever. Afterward, the bodies were not simply buried and left in the land where they had lived. The Japanese took them away. The story says the bodies were shipped back to Japan like trophies and put on public display. That detail is one of the most chilling parts, because it shows how completely the dead were stripped of dignity. They were not treated as human beings, not as warriors, not as people defending their home, not as fathers, sons, brothers, or hunters. They were treated like objects, like proof of conquest, like something to show crowds in order to celebrate power. What makes the story so disturbing is not only the violence. War is full of violence, and occupation is often full of cruelty. What makes this story stay in the mind is the betrayal. The Tayal had resisted for years. They had fought from their own land with courage and skill. The Japanese could not put them down through ordinary force, so they used the language of peace as a weapon. They used reconciliation, something meaningful and sacred, to bring people into a place where they could be trapped. They turned trust into a tool of murder. It is the kind of story that makes people feel sick, because it shows how dangerous false peace can be when it comes from someone who has no honor. A person can prepare for war. A village can prepare for soldiers. Hunters can prepare for an ambush in the forest. But it is much harder to prepare for a feast that is actually a trap, especially when your own values tell you that an offer of peace should be accepted. For the Tile who heard about it later, the lesson would have been terrible and unforgettable. It would not only have been a story about death, it would have been a story about caution, about the cost of trust, about how an empire can use another people's customs against them. It would have been a story told with anger, grief, and disbelief. The people who died had survived years of military attacks, only to be killed when they believed the fighting might finally end. And for the families connected to those victims, the pain would not have ended with the fire. The dead were gone, the survivors were killed, and even the bodies were taken away. There was no normal mourning, no peaceful burial, no final act of respect. Instead, the story says their remains were displayed far from home, in the land of the people who had destroyed them. That is a different kind of violence, one that continues even after death. The mountains of Taiwan have many old stories, and not all of them are easy to prove in every detail. Some are carried through memory, through family telling, through pain that survives longer than documents. But stories like this remain powerful because they describe something people recognize in the history of occupation everywhere. A powerful army comes into a land. The people resist. The army cannot defeat them easily, so it changes tactics. It offers peace, then uses that peace to destroy them. That is why this story feels so dark. It is not only about a massacre. It is about a small group of mountain people who stood against an empire for years, and about how they were finally broken, not by weakness, but by betrayal. We often hear the word evil used in movies, books, or casual talk. But when you start looking at what real people have done to other real people, that word begins to feel too small. Some stories are not scary because of ghosts, monsters, or anything supernatural. They are scary because they show what human beings can become when they are given power over others and allowed to use cruelty without shame, without mercy, and without anyone stopping them. One story I once heard was about a sugar plantation during the time of slavery. Sugar was one of those products that look sweet and harmless on the table, but behind it was a world of pain. The people who worked those fields did not choose that life. They were forced into it, beaten into it, and treated like tools instead of human beings. On one plantation, an enslaved man was caught eating sugar cane. Maybe he was hungry. Maybe he was exhausted. Maybe after spending his life cutting and carrying that crop for someone else, he took one small piece for himself. Whatever the reason was, the punishment was not just cruel. It was meant to destroy him inside. The plantation owner forced another enslaved person to defecate into the man's mouth, then gagged him so he could not spit it out. It is hard to even write that without feeling disgust, but that was the point of punishments like that. They were not only about pain. They were about humiliation. They were about showing every other enslaved person that even their body, their dignity, and their basic humanity could be attacked at any moment. That is one of the most disturbing things about slavery. It was not only forced labor. It was a system built to break people. The owners wanted control over every part of a person's life, their work, their food, their sleep, their family, their body, and even their hope. People were punished for trying to eat, punished for trying to rest, punished for trying to learn, punished for trying to run, punished for wanting to live like human beings. And the cruelty did not stop when the law changed to ban the importation of enslaved people from Africa. After that, in the United States, enslaved people were forced to have children so the system could continue. Families were used like livestock. Men and women were pressured, controlled, and abused, so more children would be born into slavery. Those children were then treated as property from the moment they entered the world. A baby could be born into chains before it even understood what chains were. That part is especially hard to think about because it shows how cold and planned the system was. It was not only random violence by a few terrible people, it was business. It was profit. It was a whole world of laws, markets, punishments, and customs designed to keep human beings trapped. Parents could be sold away from their children. Husbands could be separated from wives. Children could grow up knowing that at any time, someone with money could come and take them away forever. Imagine living with that fear every day. Imagine loving your family while knowing the system around you saw that love as something that could be broken for a price. There was also a woman, I think in New Orleans, who became known for torturing enslaved people so badly that even other slave owners were horrified when the truth came out. That says a lot because this was a time when cruelty was already accepted by many. For people who owned slaves to be shocked, the abuse had to be beyond what even they were used to seeing. Stories like that remind you that some people did not just benefit from slavery. They seemed to enjoy the power that came with it. They treated people locked inside their homes like objects they could hurt whenever they wanted. And when the public finally learned what had been happening, there was outrage. Not because slavery itself was suddenly seen clearly by everyone, but because the torture was so extreme that it became impossible to ignore. But slavery is only one part of the larger horror of human cruelty. If you start reading about old methods of execution, you find things that sound almost impossible. The breaking wheel, for example, was a method where a person's body was slowly destroyed in public. It was not designed to be quick. It was designed to be a show. People gathered to watch someone suffer. That is one of the most disturbing parts. The crowd. The fact that torture could become entertainment. The boats, another old method of execution, were also horrifying. People were trapped in a way that left them exposed, helpless, and slowly dying in filth and pain. These punishments were not only about killing someone, they were about stretching death out as long as possible and making suffering the message. When you read about these things, you start to realize that people in the past could be very creative in their cruelty. They did not simply punish, they designed suffering. They studied how to make fear last. They turned death into a warning, a performance, and sometimes even a kind of public celebration. And what makes it worse is that many of the people watching probably believed it was normal. Some may have even believed it was justice. That is one of the scariest truths about history. Terrible things can become ordinary when enough people accept them. And this is not only history. That may be the hardest part to accept. Right now, while people are eating dinner, scrolling on their phones, going to work, laughing with friends, and sleeping safely in warm beds, there are people in places like North Korean labor camps who are suffering in ways most of us can barely imagine. Entire families can be punished because of one person's actions or because the government decides they are enemies. Men, women, children, and even the elderly can be sent away into camps where hunger, forced labor, beatings, and fear become daily life. Some accounts from people who escaped North Korea describe camps so brutal that they sound unreal. but they are told by people who claim to have seen them with their own eyes. One former guard said that when he first saw the prisoners, he wondered if they were even human. Not because they were not human, of course, but because they had been starved, beaten, and worked down so badly that their bodies no longer looked normal. He described people who had been tortured so much that they were damaged beyond recognition. He said he was taught to see them as less than human and to treat them with no mercy. If they lived, that was fine. If they died, that was fine too. That kind of thinking is what allows the worst cruelty to happen. Before people can be abused on a massive scale, they are often first stripped of their humanity in the minds of those hurting them. They are called animals, criminals, enemies, parasites, or nothing at all. Once that happens, the people in power can convince themselves that suffering does not matter. A starving child is no longer seen as a child. A beaten woman is no longer seen as a woman. A dying man is no longer seen as a man. They become part of a system, part of a punishment, part of something that guards and officials are told not to care about. Some former prisoners have said that night was the worst time in the camps. During the day, there was hard labor, hunger, pain, and exhaustion. But at night, when the guards became bored, they could pull prisoners out for their own entertainment. Men, women, and children could be abused, beaten, raped, or tortured simply because someone with power felt like doing it. Prisoners said they would lie there praying for sleep to come quickly while screams filled the air. That image stays with you. People so helpless that their only escape is sleep, and even that is not promised. It is almost unbearable to think about families living like that right now. Not centuries ago. Not in some ancient kingdom. Not in a story from a history book. Right now. Somewhere, a child may be going to sleep hungry in a camp, afraid of footsteps outside. Somewhere, a mother may be trying to protect her child while knowing she has no power. Somewhere, a father may be working until his body gives out. Not because he committed a crime, but because he was born into the wrong family or accused by the wrong government. And the world keeps moving. That is what makes these stories so heavy. They are not just about cruelty. They are about helplessness. They are about what happens when one group of people has total control over another group, and no one steps in fast enough to stop it. Whether it is a plantation, a torture room, an execution ground, or a labor camp, the pattern is often the same. Someone decides that another person's life is worth less. Someone creates rules to protect that idea. Someone else carries out the violence. Others look away. And the victims are left with nothing but pain, fear, and the hope that someone, somewhere, will one day tell the truth about what happened to them. The most frightening thing is that many of the people who commit these acts probably do not see themselves as monsters. Plantation owners saw themselves as businessmen. Executioners saw themselves as servants of the law. Guards in prison camps may see themselves as loyal workers following orders. That is what makes human cruelty so dangerous. It does not always come with a villain's face. Sometimes it comes wearing a uniform. Sometimes it comes with paperwork. Sometimes it comes with polite language. Sometimes it hides behind tradition, law, duty, profit, or national security. When people say humans are the real monsters, this is what they mean. A wild animal kills because it is hungry or threatened. A storm destroys because it has no mind. But human beings can plan pain. They can enjoy power. They can create systems where suffering continues for years, decades, even generations. They can teach others to ignore screams. They can turn cruelty into routine. And yet remembering these things still matters. It matters because forgetting makes it easier for the same patterns to return. It matters because victims deserve more than silence. It matters because when we hear about suffering in the past, we should not treat it like a distant nightmare that has nothing to do with us. And when we hear about suffering happening now, we should not pretend it is too far away to matter. There are stories in history that make you want to close the book. There are modern accounts that make you want to look away because they are too painful. But looking away has always helped the people who do harm. The least we can do is face the truth, honestly. Human beings have done terrible things to each other. Some are still doing them. And the horror is not only in the acts themselves, but in how easily cruelty can become normal when people stop seeing each other as human. Quick interruption. I'll keep it short. A lot of people pass through here once and never come back. But the ones who hit subscribe, they're the regulars now. The ones who show up every single night without fail. If you'd like to be one of them, the button's right there. Turn the bell on too, and you'll never have to wonder when the next one drops. That's everything. Story's still going. Let's get back to it. I was 6 years old when something happened in my home that I still don't fully know how to process, even after all these years. I don't remember every detail the way an adult would remember an event, but I remember enough. Enough sounds, enough movement, enough fear that it stayed with me in a way that never really fades, even when you try to push it away. We were living in a normal house at the time. Nothing about it looked unusual from the outside. It was just a regular home. Rooms connected by hallways, doors that creaked slightly when open, and a quiet kind of everyday life that you don't think twice about when you're a child. I didn't understand adult arguments or tension back then. I only understood moods, voices, and the feeling in the air when something was wrong. That night started like any other. I don't even remember what led up to it exactly, just that there was a shift. Something changed in my father's behavior, something sharp and sudden that I didn't have the language to understand at the time. It escalated quickly, faster than anything a child should ever have to witness. The first thing I clearly remember is fear. Not confusion, not curiosity, but pure fear. The kind that makes your body react before your mind can catch up. My mother was trying to protect me, and I remember her pulling me along as we moved through the house. We weren't standing still. We were moving fast, trying to put distance between us and him, going from room to room, like the house itself could offer some kind of safety if we just reached the right place. But there was no safety in that moment, only urgency. We ended up in the master bathroom. I remember the door closing, the lock turning, and the sudden silence that followed. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that feels temporary, like it can break at any second. My mother was trying to keep me behind her body positioned between me and the door. I didn't fully understand why at the time, but I understood enough to stay quiet. Outside the bathroom, things were getting worse. There was shouting. There was movement through the house, footsteps that didn't stop, the sound of doors opening and closing. And then the sound that I remember most clearly, even though I wish I didn't. The door to the bathroom started to take impact, not from fists alone, but from something sharp, something being driven into it repeatedly. Wood doesn't hold forever. It starts to give slowly, in small warnings before anything actually breaks through. I remember seeing the door tremble with each strike, feeling like the barrier between us and everything outside was getting thinner every second. And there were words. I don't remember every sentence perfectly, but I remember the tone. Angry, distorted, loud enough to fill the hallway and the room we were hiding in. There were threats being said through the door, things no child should ever hear, especially not directed at their own life or their mother's. I remember my mother whispering to me to stay quiet, to stay close, but I could feel how tense she was. She wasn't calm either. She was trying to hold everything together in a situation where there was nothing stable to hold on to. At some point, she reached for something she had with her. Later, I understood it was a small handgun, something her father had given her long before. I didn't understand what it meant at the time. I just remember her holding it in a way that told me it wasn't something she wanted to use unless there was no other choice. Even as a child, I could sense that. Everything in that moment was about survival. Nothing else mattered. The banging on the door continued, and there was a point where it felt like the barrier might fail completely. I remember my mother leaning in closer to me, shielding me with her body, her attention split between me and the door. It felt like time was moving strangely, like everything was happening in slow motion, but also too fast to process properly. And then suddenly, there was another shift. Not inside the house, but outside it. Sirens, voices, movement that didn't belong to the two of us or the person outside the door. It took a moment for me to understand what it meant. But my mother understood immediately. Relief and panic can exist at the same time, and I remember feeling both in her reaction. The presence outside the door changed. The intensity changed. Things that were happening in that moment were interrupted by something larger, something that wasn't part of the house anymore. Police had arrived. What happened after that is something I remember in fragments, doors opening, loud commands, fast movement. The sense of control shifting away from what was happening inside the house to something outside it. I remember being held close, not fully seeing everything, but hearing enough to know that the situation had changed completely. Later, I was told more about what happened in those final moments, that the police arrived in time, that they stopped what was happening before it could go any further, that my mother had been ready to defend both of us if she had needed to. Those are things I didn't understand at 6 years old, but I understood them later in life in a different way. Not as abstract ideas, but as real decisions made in a moment where there was no time for hesitation. After that night, life didn't instantly go back to normal. It never really does after something like that. Even when you're young, something changes in the way you see safety, even if you don't fully understand why. Houses feel different. Doors feel different. Silence feels different. I didn't have the words for it then, but I do now. Years passed, and that memory stayed in the background of my life. Not always at the front of my thoughts, but never fully gone either. It was one of those experiences that sits in you quietly, shaping how you understand fear and protection, and the people you trust to keep you safe. Then, many years later, something else happened that brought a completely different kind of fear into my life. A different situation, a different place, but the same sudden shift from normal to danger. I was working as an Uber driver at the time. It was during a regular day, nothing unusual about it. Driving had become routine for me, just another way to work and move through the day. You meet all kinds of people doing that job, most of them normal, most of them just trying to get from one place to another. It was election day, and the city had a strange energy to it. Not necessarily chaotic, but tense in a way that you could feel in small interactions, in traffic, in conversations overheard at stoplights. I remember picking up my first passenger of the day, not thinking anything of it. You don't assume danger every time someone gets into your car. If you did, you couldn't do the job at all. At first, everything seemed completely normal. The ride itself was quiet. No signs of anything unusual, just a standard trip to a destination, the kind you complete without remembering it later. But things changed very suddenly near the end of the ride. We had arrived at the destination, and that's when the behavior shifted. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate. The kind of change that makes your brain take a second to catch up because it doesn't match what came before. The passenger started fumbling with something, and before I fully understood what was happening, he reached across and shut off the ignition. My keys were pulled away. My phone was taken. Everything that connects you to control, communication, and escape gets stripped away in seconds when something like that happens. And then there was a voice right beside me. Low, close, and controlled in a way that made it more terrifying, not less. He told me to get out of the car. The words weren't shouted. They were spoken directly, almost calmly, but with a threat underneath them that didn't need explanation. I could feel how close he was. I could feel his presence right next to me in a way that made everything else disappear. There was a gun involved. I could feel it pressed near me, a physical reminder that the situation was no longer just a threat, but something immediate and real. There's a strange clarity that comes in moments like that. You stop thinking about everything except what is happening right then. The car, which had been normal just moments before, suddenly didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like I was inside someone else's decision. He took the vehicle. He took my phone. He left with them, leaving me behind at the location, with nothing in my hands except the reality of what had just happened. He didn't take everything, though. He didn't take my wallet or my wedding ring. At the time, I remember noticing that detail strangely clearly, like my brain was trying to find logic in something that didn't have any. Afterward, everything goes into motion in a different way. Police reports, statements explaining things over and over again, the kind of administrative reality that follows a moment of immediate danger. But emotionally, you're still stuck in the moment itself for a long time after everyone else has moved on to procedures. What connects both of these experiences in my mind is not just the fear, but the suddenness. Both moments began as normal life. A house, a job, ordinary situations that didn't feel dangerous until they were. And in both cases, what I remember most is not just what happened, but how quickly normal disappeared. Even now, when I think back on them, I don't experience them as distant stories. They feel like moments that are still close enough to touch. And while I don't want to turn those experiences into something supernatural or assign meaning to things I can't prove, I also understand why certain experiences make people question the boundaries of what they think they know about safety, chance, and control. Because once you've lived through situations like that, the world doesn't feel as predictable as it used to. I'm not going to jump straight to ghosts or anything like that, because there are plenty of ways the human brain and the environment can create experiences that feel extremely real without anything supernatural involved. I also don't think it helps to just dismiss something like this out of hand, because the important part is not only what could have caused it, but how real it felt in the moment and how consistent it seemed across different people in the same house. This happened during a period when I was living in my parents' basement. It was a quiet phase of life, the kind where your days don't have much structure and your mind becomes more aware of small things around you. Sleep patterns weren't perfect. Stress came and went depending on school and life in general. And the house itself was old enough that it already had its own strange sounds and behaviors. Basements especially can do that. They feel separate from the rest of the house, like their own small world, and sounds don't always behave the way you expect them to. But what makes this memory stick with me isn't just that I heard something unusual. It's that other people experienced it too at the same time from different parts of the house. I was asleep in the basement when it started. I woke up suddenly, not slowly, not drifting, but almost instantly, like something pulled me out of sleep. The first thing I became aware of was sound. There was laughter. It was coming from the playroom area nearby, or at least that's how it seemed. It wasn't vague or distant in a way that I could easily ignore. It sounded clear enough that my brain immediately labeled it as laughter without hesitation. That detail matters more than it seems at first. The human brain is constantly trying to identify patterns, especially with sounds. Even when something is unclear, your mind tries to match it with something familiar. A place like a playroom, especially one filled with old toys, games, and childhood items, already carries a kind of mental association with voices, activity, and play. So when you hear a sudden burst of sound while half asleep, your brain can very quickly interpret it as something like laughter, even if the source is not clear. At first, I didn't question it deeply. I just reacted to it. I remember feeling alert immediately, like my body had switched from sleep mode to full awareness in seconds. I reached for my phone and called my mother upstairs because it didn't feel like something I could just ignore or explain away in my head. What makes this part important is what happened next. My mother picked up and I told her what I had heard. I expected her to either tell me I was dreaming or say she hadn't heard anything. But instead, she paused and said she had heard something too. Not exactly the same description right away, but something in the house that caught her attention at the same time I was reacting to it. That changed the situation immediately. Now it wasn't just me waking up confused from sleep. There was another person in a completely different part of the house who had also registered something unusual at the same moment. But the most surprising part came after that. My older sister, who was in a different area of the house entirely, on a separate level and far from both me and my mother, also experienced something at the same time. When we later compared what we each thought we had heard or sensed, her description also aligned with the idea that something had happened in the house in that exact window of time. That overlap is what made the experience stick in all of our minds. It wasn't just one person reacting emotionally or waking up from a dream. It was multiple people, independently, in different parts of the same house, all noticing something unusual within the same moment. That's where your mind naturally starts trying to find explanations. One of the first and most reasonable explanations is sound traveling in strange ways through the structure of the house. Houses, especially older ones or those with basements, ventilation systems, and multiple connected rooms, can carry sound in ways that are not always intuitive. A noise from outside the house or from another part of the building can travel through air ducts, walls, or stairwells and arrive somewhere completely different from where it originated. When that happens, it can sound distorted or unfamiliar, which makes the brain try to reinterpret it into something recognizable. So in that sense, it's possible that there was a real sound event somewhere in or around the house that we all heard in different ways depending on our location. One person might interpret it as laughter, another might hear it as movement or voices, and someone else might just register it as a general noise without clear identity. Another possibility is that there was a short, unclear sound that multiple people interpreted the same way independently. The brain is very good at categorizing ambiguous sounds, and if something resembles laughter even slightly, especially in a quiet house at night, Different people can arrive at the same conclusion without talking to each other. Once one person identifies it as laughter in their mind, others might independently do the same simply because the pattern fits. Then there's the sleep factor, especially in my case. Waking up suddenly like that puts you into a transitional state between sleep and full awareness. In that state, perception is not always stable. Sounds can feel sharper, closer, or more meaningful than they really are. The brain is still partially in dream processing mode, which can sometimes blend real environmental noise with internal imagery or expectation. In that condition, it's not uncommon for people to experience very vivid auditory impressions that feel completely real in the moment. But even if all of those explanations are valid, there's still something about the experience that makes it hard to fully reduce to just one simple cause. Because the part that stays with you isn't just the sound itself, it's the coordination of it. The fact that more than one person, in different locations, reacted to something at the same time. Even if each person's interpretation was slightly different, the timing aligned in a way that makes it feel significant when you look back on it. And that's where these kinds of experiences become difficult to fully settle in your mind. They don't sit neatly in one category. They aren't strong enough to prove anything unusual is happening, but they are also specific enough that you can't just forget them as nothing. In the end, the most honest way to describe it is that it was one of those moments where perception, timing, environment, and memory all lined up in a way that felt meaningful. Not necessarily supernatural, not necessarily explainable in a satisfying single answer, but somewhere in that middle space where human experience often exists. It's the kind of event that doesn't change what you believe completely, but it does change how you feel about certainty. Because once you've lived through something like that, you realize how easily reality can feel slightly out of place without actually breaking any rules at all. By the time he reached adulthood, his relationship with faith had already become complicated. Religion had been a major part of his upbringing, and for years he tried to hold on to it with sincerity. But the older he became, the more questions started building inside him. He was not the kind of man who could blindly accept things forever. Success, fame, war, guilt, friendships, and the changing world around him had slowly reshaped the way he thought. Even though many people still saw him as confident and accomplished from the outside, internally he was often restless. There was a constant tension between the beliefs he had inherited and the reality he kept witnessing around him. During the mid-1950s, while preparing ideas and sketches for what would later become the Calculus Affair, he traveled to Geneva. Like he often did during the creation of his books, he spent time carefully studying real locations. He believed details mattered. Streets, buildings, landscapes, even small corners of cities were important to him because he wanted his stories to feel alive. So he wandered around Geneva sketching local scenes, taking notes, observing the lake, the atmosphere, the people, and the quiet beauty of the city. He was staying near the lake at the time, in one of those calm hotels where the silence almost feels heavy at night. Geneva looked peaceful on the surface. The water reflected the sky so clearly that some mornings the lake appeared endless. Tourists admired its beauty, couples walked beside it, and boats crossed quietly through the cold air. But Europe in the 1950s still carried invisible scars from the war. Even in places that looked calm, memories of fear and betrayal were never very far away. One of the people he met there was an old priest. This was not unusual for him. Throughout his life, several important mentors and guides had been members of the clergy. Ironically, many of the people who pushed him toward greater understanding, compassion, and openness were religious figures, while some people imagine religion making a person more closed-minded. In his case, it had often done the opposite. Certain priests and thinkers around him encouraged curiosity about other cultures and other people. They pushed him to look beyond prejudice. Years earlier, one of the biggest turning points in his life had been meeting his Chinese friend Chang. Before that friendship, some of his earlier ideas about foreign cultures had been influenced by stereotypes and narrow European thinking of the time. But Chang changed him deeply. Through genuine friendship, he began seeing people differently. That shift became visible in his work from the Blue Lotus onward. His stories slowly became more human, less judgmental, and more thoughtful about the world. He moved away from simplistic ideas of good foreigners and bad foreigners, and became someone far more empathetic than he had once been. Still, empathy did not make life simpler for him. In many ways, it made things harder. Once you start seeing the complexity inside people, certainty becomes difficult. Faith becomes difficult, too. The old priest in Geneva fascinated him almost immediately. He was not dramatic or intimidating. In fact, he seemed calm and intelligent, the sort of man whose voice naturally made people listen. There was wisdom in the way he spoke, but also sadness. The priest carried himself like someone who had seen terrible things and learned to live with them quietly. One evening, the priest invited him onto the lake. The weather was cool and the water moved gently beneath the boat. The city lights reflected across the surface in broken lines. It should have felt peaceful, but the conversation slowly turned darker. As they drifted farther from shore, the priest began talking about the war years. Like many people from that generation, he carried memories that never fully disappeared. He spoke about fear, secrecy, disappearances, and the strange moral confusion that war creates in ordinary people. During wartime, he explained, evil rarely looks obvious at first. Sometimes it hides behind kindness, respectability, or even heroism. Then he told him a story from the local area. During World War II, there had been a man around the lake who was widely admired by the town. Everyone believed he was courageous and selfless. According to local stories, he helped Jewish refugees escape to freedom by secretly rowing them across the water at night. People treated him almost like a legend. The townsfolk protected him, praised him quietly, and saw him as proof that humanity could survive even during terrible times. The priest paused for a long moment before continuing. The truth, he said softly, was much darker. The man really did take refugees onto the lake. He really did promise them freedom on the other side. But he only rowed them halfway across. Out there, in the darkness, away from witnesses, he robbed them. Then he killed them and dumped their bodies into the water. The priest explained that almost nobody knew the full truth. The town continued believing in the heroic version of the story because it was easier. People wanted to believe goodness had existed during the war. They needed heroes. The reality was too horrifying, too ugly to fully accept. A man everyone respected had turned desperate refugees into victims. He had used hope itself as a weapon. The story hit him hard. As the boat drifted across the dark lake, he stared into the black water and imagined those nights during the war. Frightened families sitting silently in a small boat. Exhausted people believing they were finally escaping death. Parents trying to comfort children. Maybe someone praying quietly under their breath. Then somewhere in the darkness, far from land, realizing too late that the man guiding them was not their savior. What disturbed him most was not just the crime itself. It was the contradiction. The man had appeared kind, brave, moral. An entire town had trusted him. Even after the war, people continued speaking about him as if he were a hero. The difference between appearance and reality suddenly felt terrifyingly thin. The priest himself seemed deeply affected by the story even years later. He spoke without anger, but there was exhaustion in his voice, as though carrying knowledge like that slowly wears down a person's certainty about humanity. For someone already struggling spiritually, the conversation dug directly into his deepest fears. Religion had taught him about good and evil, virtue and sin, saints and monsters, but real life rarely divided itself so cleanly. Human beings were capable of kindness and cruelty at the same time. A respected man could secretly be a murderer. Entire communities could unknowingly protect evil because they wanted comforting stories more than painful truths. After they returned to shore, he eventually went back to his hotel. The quiet halls and warm lights of the building felt strangely unreal after the conversation on the lake. He was still thinking about the story when the concierge casually asked whether he had spent time with the priest. Yes, he answered. What an interesting man. The concierge smiled warmly. And a good man, too, he said. During the war, he rowed Jews to freedom across the lake. He was the only man brave enough to do it. For a moment, everything froze in his mind. The exact same story. The exact same role. But now told completely differently. He realized immediately what the priest had confessed without directly confessing it. The old man himself had been the rower. Suddenly, the entire conversation transformed. The sadness in the priest's voice, the exhaustion, the strange intimacy with the details, the moral complexity. It all snapped together at once in a deeply unsettling way. But even then, certainty remained impossible. Was the priest confessing guilt? Was he lying? Was he testing him somehow? Had the priest truly murdered innocent people? Or had he only convinced himself he was capable of evil after surviving the moral chaos of war? Maybe he had genuinely saved people, but carried survivors' guilt so severe that he no longer believed in his own goodness. Or maybe the horrifying story was completely true. That uncertainty became the real nightmare, because now he could no longer comfortably separate people into simple categories. Was the priest a hero, a killer, both? Could someone commit terrible acts and still spend the rest of their life serving God? Could redemption exist after something like that? Could faith survive knowing what human beings were capable of? These questions stayed with him long after the trip ended. People often imagine crises of faith as dramatic moments where someone suddenly stops believing overnight. In reality, it is usually slower and more painful than that. It happens through conversations, contradictions, and experiences that refuse to fit neatly into the moral structure you once trusted. Every disturbing truth becomes another small crack in certainty. For him, the war years had already damaged many illusions. Europe had witnessed unimaginable cruelty carried out not only by obvious monsters, but by ordinary people. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. Respectable citizens participated in evil. Governments justified horrors using morality and patriotism. After seeing all that, simple answers about good and evil became harder to accept. The story of the priest condensed all those fears into one haunting memory. A man devoted to God carrying a secret darker than most criminals. A town worshiping a false image because the truth was unbearable. A lake beautiful enough to attract artists and tourists while hiding memories of terror beneath its surface. And at the center of it all, a deeply sensitive artist trying to understand whether morality, redemption, And faith could still mean anything in a world where human beings were so painfully complicated. He continued struggling with his faith for the rest of his life, not because he wanted to reject spirituality completely, but because he could no longer accept easy certainty. The older he became, the more he realized that human beings rarely fit into simple moral categories. People carried contradictions everywhere. Kindness and cruelty could exist inside the same person. Heroism and selfishness could overlap. Even religion itself could inspire compassion in one person and blindness in another. That realization shaped his later worldview and his work. His stories gradually became less interested in simplistic villains and more interested in flawed humanity. He understood fear, guilt, loneliness, greed, and compassion in more mature ways than he had when he was younger. The world no longer appeared black and white to him. And somewhere in his memory, the image likely remained forever. A quiet lake at night, an old priest speaking softly in the darkness, and the terrifying possibility that the line between savior and monster may be far thinner than anyone wants to believe. During the 1960s and into the 1970s, France was going through a period of major political and military change. One of the biggest shocks to the country came when it lost control of Algeria after a long and brutal war of independence. Algeria had not just been another colony to France. For many French leaders at the time, it was treated almost like an extension of France itself. The loss was humiliating to some politicians and military officials, especially because Algeria had also become deeply connected to France's nuclear ambitions. Out in the isolated deserts of Algeria, France had carried out some of its earliest nuclear weapons tests. These locations were chosen because they were remote, far away from mainland Europe, and easier to keep secret. Nuclear powers during the Cold War all wanted places where they could test bombs away from public attention. The United States used parts of Nevada and the Pacific. The Soviet Union used distant regions in Kazakhstan and Siberia. Britain relied heavily on remote areas connected to its former empire. France wanted the same kind of freedom to continue building its nuclear arsenal. But once Algeria became independent in 1962, France suddenly faced a problem. Their old testing grounds were no longer safely under their control forever. Even though there were temporary agreements allowing some continued testing for a few years, French military planners knew they eventually needed a new location. They wanted somewhere isolated, politically controllable, and far from mainland France, where they could continue developing nuclear weapons without constant interference. Eventually, they focused on French Polynesia in the Pacific Ocean. To people looking at maps in Paris, the islands probably seemed perfect. Remote, distant, surrounded by enormous stretches of ocean, and still firmly under French control. But of course, those islands were not empty. People had lived there for generations. Entire communities had histories, traditions, families, and cultures tied to those lands and waters. Still, during that era, governments carrying out nuclear programs often treated local populations as secondary concerns compared to military goals. France selected areas including Mururoa and Fangatofa atolls for nuclear testing. Officials promised safety. They described the operations as controlled and necessary. Publicly, governments often tried to present nuclear testing as scientific, modern, and manageable. But reality was far messier. People living in the region were relocated from some areas to make room for the testing operations. Many islanders had little real power to object. The French military presence became enormous. Equipment, soldiers, scientists, ships, and infrastructure flooded into places that had once been quiet islands, surrounded mostly by fishing communities and small local populations. Then the testing began. At first, many of the explosions were atmospheric nuclear tests, meaning bombs were detonated above ground rather than underground. Those kinds of tests were especially dangerous because radioactive particles could spread through the air over huge distances. By the 1960s, much of the world already understood how risky atmospheric testing could be. Scientists had been warning about radioactive fallout for years. Even some governments conducting nuclear tests privately understood the dangers better than they admitted publicly. Yet despite that knowledge, safety precautions around the French tests were often dangerously inadequate. Reports over the years suggested that radioactive fallout spread much farther than officials initially claimed. Wind patterns carried contamination across islands where ordinary civilians lived. Some military personnel and local workers were exposed without fully understanding the risks. Protective measures were sometimes weak or inconsistent. There were accusations that information about contamination levels was hidden, minimized, or delayed. For many island residents, the effects were invisible at first. Radiation is terrifying partly because you cannot see it directly. There is no dramatic movie-style green glow. Life appears normal while contamination quietly spreads through air, rain, soil, food, and water. Over time, concerns began growing about cancer rates and long-term health problems among local populations and veterans connected to the testing program. But during the height of the Cold War, secrecy surrounded nuclear programs almost everywhere. Governments feared public outrage, international criticism, and political weakness. France especially viewed its nuclear arsenal as central to its national independence and global status. Possessing nuclear weapons meant being taken seriously as a world power. French leaders believed maintaining that deterrent was essential no matter the cost. Because of this mindset, criticism of the Pacific testing program was often dismissed or attacked aggressively. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, international opposition to nuclear testing grew stronger. Environmental groups, anti-nuclear activists, journalists, scientists, and neighboring Pacific nations became increasingly vocal. Many people felt the Pacific was being treated like a sacrifice zone by powerful countries conducting dangerous experiments far away from their own populations. One organization that became especially active was Greenpeace. At the time, Greenpeace was still developing its global reputation for direct action environmental protests. Their activists often used ships to physically travel near controversial sites in order to draw media attention. These voyages were dramatic on purpose. They wanted cameras, headlines, and public pressure. One of their most famous ships was the Rainbow Warrior. The ship became a symbol of environmental activism. Greenpeace planned protests connected to the French nuclear testing operations in the Pacific, and French authorities became deeply concerned about the growing international embarrassment. Officials feared the protests could disrupt operations, damage France's reputation, and strengthen anti-nuclear pressure worldwide. Instead of simply ignoring the activists, elements within the French government made a shocking decision. In 1985, while the Rainbow Warrior was docked in New Zealand, French intelligence agents secretly carried out an operation against it. Their mission was sabotage. Agents planted explosives on the ship intending to sink it and stop the protest mission before it reached the testing zone. The bombing succeeded in destroying the vessel, but it also killed a man named Fernando Pereira, a photographer working with Greenpeace. He drowned after returning to the ship, reportedly trying to retrieve equipment and photographs after the first explosion. The incident caused massive international outrage. It was one thing for governments to spy on activists. That was already common during the Cold War. But sending secret agents into an allied country to bomb a civilian protest ship crossed a line that shocked many people. France initially denied involvement, but evidence quickly mounted. Eventually, the French government admitted responsibility. The scandal damaged France's reputation badly. New Zealand was furious. Environmental groups gained sympathy around the world. The bombing transformed the Rainbow Warrior into a powerful symbol of state secrecy and overreach. For many people, the incident also deepened suspicions about the nuclear testing program itself. If the French government was willing to conduct covert sabotage operations against protesters, people wondered what else they might be hiding about the tests and their environmental consequences. By the late 1980s, global pressure against nuclear testing kept increasing. Public opinion around the world had shifted significantly compared to the early Cold War years. More countries criticized atmospheric tests. Environmental awareness was growing rapidly. The image of remote islands being contaminated for weapons programs became harder to defend politically. Eventually, France moved away from atmospheric detonations and later reduced testing activity. For a while, it seemed like the era might finally be ending. But then came the 1990s. To many observers, what happened next felt almost surreal. In 1995, French President Jacques Chirac announced the resumption of nuclear testing in French Polynesia after a testing pause. The decision shocked environmental groups and angered many governments across the Pacific region. Critics argued the Cold War was over. Global tensions had changed, and there was no urgent reason to restart detonations. Massive protests erupted internationally. Demonstrations spread across multiple countries. Boycotts of French goods were encouraged in some places. Activists returned to the Pacific to protest again. The decision reopened old wounds among Polynesian communities who had already spent decades living under the shadow of nuclear contamination fears. To supporters inside France, the tests were presented as necessary for ensuring the reliability and safety of the French nuclear arsenal before transitioning fully to computer simulations. Military officials argued that a final series of tests would allow France to maintain confidence in its weapons without needing continued live detonations afterward. But to critics, it looked like history repeating itself. Once again, distant islands and local populations were expected to bear the burden of decisions made thousands of miles away in Paris. The renewed test intensified debates about colonialism, environmental justice, and the ethics of nuclear weapons. Many Polynesians felt their voices still mattered less than military priorities. Activists argued that powerful nations often treated remote territories differently from how they would treat their own mainland populations. Eventually, France permanently ended its nuclear testing program in the Pacific later in the 1990s and signed agreements connected to broader nuclear test bans. But the legacy of those decades never fully disappeared. Even today, debates continue about the long-term health effects on local populations, military personnel, and workers connected to the testing sites. Questions about radiation exposure, cancer rates, environmental contamination, and government transparency still surface regularly. Some victims and families spent years fighting for recognition and compensation. For many people in French Polynesia, the issue was never just about bombs. It was about being treated as expendable by a distant government pursuing global power. It was about secrecy, denial, and the feeling that ordinary people were forced to live with consequences they never truly agreed to. And for the wider world, the story became another example of how the Cold War pushed governments into decisions that often prioritized military prestige over human safety. Beneath the language of deterrence, strategy, and national security were real communities whose lives changed permanently because powerful nations wanted to prove their strength. The story of the Batavia honestly feels less like real history and more like some giant survival epic written by a novelist who kept throwing new horrors into the plot just to see how much chaos people could survive. It has everything: mutiny, betrayal, shipwrecks, massacres, starvation, psychological collapse, desperate heroism, and a final ending so dramatic it almost sounds fake. But every major part of it really happened. The Batavia was a Dutch East India Company ship launched in the 1620s during the height of the Dutch Golden Age. At the time, the Dutch East India Company was one of the richest and most powerful organizations in the world. It was not just a trading company in the modern sense. It had armies, ships, political influence, and near-government level power. Its vessels traveled enormous distances between Europe and Asia, carrying money, goods, weapons, and passengers through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. In 1628, the Batavia left the Netherlands on its maiden voyage, heading toward the Dutch East Indies, which is modern-day Indonesia. On board were hundreds of people: sailors, officers, merchants, soldiers, women, children, and passengers, hoping for new opportunities overseas. The ship also carried an enormous cargo of treasure and trade goods, making it extremely valuable. From the outside, it looked like a normal company expedition. But underneath the surface, things were already rotting before the ship even reached open ocean. One of the central figures in the story was Geronimus Cornelis, a former apothecary who had joined the voyage after his life in the Netherlands collapsed. Cornelis is one of those historical figures who sounds almost fictional because of how terrifyingly manipulative and unstable he became. Historians believe he may have been suffering from syphilis, which in its later stages can seriously affect the brain and personality. Whether that fully explains his behavior or not, something inside him had clearly broken long before the wreck. He was intelligent, charismatic, resentful, ambitious, and deeply dangerous. Cornelis became involved in a mutiny plot during the voyage. The plan was essentially piracy from the inside. He and his allies intended to seize control of the Batavia, murder or abandon loyal officers, steal the treasure, and disappear into a life of outlaw freedom. The Dutch East India Company was brutally strict, and life aboard these ships was miserable for many sailors. Mutiny was not unheard of, but the scale of what Cornelis planned was extreme. Tensions aboard the ship grew steadily. There were power struggles between officers and crew, punishments, fear, distrust. Cornelis and his followers quietly built support while waiting for the right moment to act. But before the mutiny could fully happen, disaster struck first. In June 1629, during the night, the Batavia smashed into a reef off the western coast of Australia. At the time, Europeans barely understood those waters. Australia itself had not yet been properly explored or mapped by Europeans in the way it would later be. The coastline was dangerous, remote, and unforgiving. The ship broke apart on coral reefs near a chain of tiny barren islands known today as the Houtman-Abrolhos Islands. Suddenly, hundreds of survivors found themselves stranded in one of the most isolated places imaginable. The environment was horrifying. These islands were basically dry, rocky strips of land with little fresh water and almost no resources. The survivors were trapped far from established settlements or reliable rescue routes. The ocean around them was dangerous, the heat brutal, and supplies limited. At first, survival itself seemed like the main problem. The ship's commander, Francisco Pelcert, realized quickly that without fresh water, everyone would die. So he made a desperate decision. Taking a small group and one of the surviving boats, he left the islands to search for help. Amazingly, after an incredibly difficult journey, he managed to reach Batavia, the Dutch colonial headquarters in Indonesia. It was a remarkable achievement in itself. But his departure created a terrible power vacuum back on the islands, and that is when the real nightmare began. With most authority figures gone, Cornelis saw his opportunity. The mutiny plot had been interrupted by the wreck, but now he adapted his ambitions to the new situation. If rescue eventually arrived, he and his followers would still face punishment for mutiny. So he decided the only way to survive was to seize total control of the survivors. His methods became monstrous almost immediately. Cornelis organized his loyal followers into armed groups and slowly started eliminating anyone who might threaten his power. At first, the murders were disguised or selective, but over time, they turned into outright massacres. Men, women, and children were slaughtered across the islands. Some victims had their throats cut while sleeping. Others were drowned, stabbed, or beaten to death. People considered useless were murdered simply to conserve food and water. Women were kept alive largely for sexual slavery. Cornelis and his inner circle created a terrifying little dictatorship isolated from the rest of the world, where survival depended entirely on obedience. What makes the story especially horrifying is how quickly civilization collapsed. These were not wild tribes or hardened criminals from the beginning. Many of the survivors had been ordinary people just weeks earlier. But isolation, fear, desperation, and the absence of law transformed the islands into something resembling a nightmare version of Lord of the Flies. Cornelis himself reportedly avoided personally killing many victims because he feared execution laws that treated direct murder more harshly. Instead, he manipulated others into carrying out the violence. That detail somehow makes him even more chilling. He understood systems, fear, and psychology extremely well. But while Cornelis was building his reign of terror, another group of survivors accidentally became the biggest obstacle to his plans. Earlier, Cornelis had sent a group of soldiers led by a man named Weeby Hayes to one of the nearby islands, supposedly to search for water. In reality, he likely hoped they would simply die there from thirst and exposure, removing potential opposition. Instead, something unexpected happened. Hayes and his men actually found fresh water. That discovery completely changed everything. Weeby Hayes turned out to be the unlikely hero of the entire story. Before the wreck, he was not some famous warrior or noble commander. He was just a relatively ordinary soldier. But once the crisis began, he stepped up with remarkable courage and intelligence. Hayes quickly realized something was terribly wrong with Cornelis's faction. Survivors arriving from other islands brought horrifying stories of murder and abuse. Hayes understood that if his group did nothing, they would eventually be hunted down too. So on this tiny remote chain of islands off the coast of barely known Australia, two factions formed. One side was Cornelis and his murderous mutineers. The other was Hayes and the desperate survivors, trying to stay alive. What followed feels almost impossible to believe. The survivors under Hayes fortified their island using improvised defenses made from stone and wreckage. They organized watches, distributed supplies carefully, and prepared for attacks. Meanwhile, Cornelis armed his followers and attempted to wipe them out before rescue could arrive. Actual battles broke out between the groups. Tiny island skirmishes were fought with swords, muskets, clubs, makeshift weapons, and whatever else survivors could use. Hayes' people, despite having fewer resources, repeatedly fought off attacks from Cornelis's gang. The good faction slowly became disciplined and united through sheer necessity, while the mutineers grew increasingly desperate and unstable. At one point, Hayes's group even captured Cornelis himself during negotiations. Imagine how insane this all sounds in context. A Dutch merchant ship wrecks near unexplored Australia. Mutineers attempt to build a pirate kingdom from the survivors. Murder cult factions form on isolated islands. Women are enslaved. Innocent people are massacred. Then ordinary soldiers suddenly become resistance fighters defending a tiny island fortress against psychopaths while waiting for rescue. And somehow it still gets crazier. Months after the wreck, rescue ships finally appeared on the horizon. For Hayes and the survivors, it was salvation. For Cornelis's remaining followers, it meant the end. When the rescue party arrived, Hayes's group managed to warn them about the mutineers before Cornelis's faction could seize the ship. The plot collapsed immediately. Mutineers were arrested. Evidence of the massacres was uncovered, and the scale of the horror became clear. The punishments were brutal even by the standards of the time. Several mutineers were executed on the islands themselves. Others were taken away for trial. Cornelis was tortured and eventually executed in Batavia. According to historical accounts, his hands were cut off before his execution. 2 mutineers were abandoned on mainland Australia instead of being formally executed, which may have accidentally made them some of the first Europeans to permanently live on the Australian continent, though their ultimate fate remains unknown. The Batavia story shocked people even in the 1600s because it revealed how quickly human beings could descend into savagery under the right conditions. But it also became famous because of figures like Weeby Hayes, who represented the opposite side of human nature. While some people embraced cruelty and power, others organized, protected the weak, and fought back despite overwhelming fear. That balance between horror and heroism is part of what makes the story unforgettable. The islands themselves still feel eerie today. Archaeologists have recovered artifacts, skeletons, coins, weapons, and wreckage connected to the disaster. Divers have explored parts of the Batavia wreck beneath the sea. Historians continue studying the event because it offers such a raw example of social collapse and extreme isolation. And maybe the strangest part is how cinematic the entire thing feels. Every time the story seems like it has reached maximum insanity, another layer appears. Shipwreck survival becomes mutiny. Mutiny becomes mass murder. Mass murder becomes island warfare. Island warfare becomes a race against time before rescue arrives. If someone wrote it as fiction exactly as it happened, people would probably complain it was unrealistic. But history sometimes creates stories far stranger and darker than anything novels invent. In the days before the murders, the Gruber family had already started to feel that something was wrong around their lonely farm. They lived at Hinterkaifeck, a remote farmstead in Bavaria, far away from the comfort of busy streets and close neighbors. It was the kind of place where silence could feel normal during the day, but at night it could become heavy and uncomfortable. Every small sound had space to travel. A creak in the wood, a movement in the barn, a scrape above the ceiling. All of it could stand out in a house that was surrounded by fields, snow, darkness, and distance. The family was made up of Andreas Gruber, who was 63, and his wife Cecilia, who was 72. Their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, also lived there with her 2 children. 7-year-old Cecilia, and little Joseph, who was only 2. A new maid named Maria Baumgartner had also just arrived to work at the farm. She was 44 years old, and tragically, she had come to the house on the very day her life would end. None of them could have known that the strange signs around the farm were not just harmless noises or imagination. They were warnings. In the days leading up to March 31st, 1922, the family reportedly heard footsteps coming from the attic. That detail alone makes the story deeply disturbing, because an attic is not like hearing a noise outside in the wind. An attic is part of the house. It is above you while you sleep, above you while you eat, above you while you try to live normally. To hear movement up there would mean someone or something might be inside the home itself, not walking past, not hiding in the forest, inside. They also heard other strange noises around the farm. These were not enough at first to make the family flee, but they were enough to worry them. Living in an isolated place can make people handle fear differently. In a city or village, someone might run next door or call for help right away. But on a lonely farm, people often try to explain things away because they have to keep working. Animals still need to be fed. Fires still need to be kept going. Children still need care. Life does not pause just because the house feels wrong. Then came the footprints. After snowfall, Andreas reportedly found tracks in the snow leading from the edge of the woods toward the farm, specifically toward the barn. But there were no footprints leading back out. That was the kind of sign that should have caused panic. Someone had come to the property, but there was no clear evidence that they had left. It suggested the impossible and horrifying thought that an intruder might still be nearby, hidden somewhere on the farm. Tools also went missing. A key was said to have disappeared. Things were no longer where they should have been. These details seem small by themselves, but together they create a terrifying picture. Footsteps in the attic. Footprints leading in but not out. Missing items. Noises in a remote farmhouse. It all suggests that the family may have been watched for days before the attack. Some people have even believed that the killer may have been secretly living somewhere on the property, possibly in the attic or another hidden area, moving around when the family was not looking. That idea is almost unbearable to imagine. The family may have been going about their daily lives while a stranger listened above them. He may have heard their conversations, watched their routines, learned who slept where, learned when each person was alone, and waited for the right moment. There is something especially frightening about a person hiding inside a home, because the home is supposed to be the safest place. When that safety is taken away, everything becomes uncertain. Even familiar rooms can feel threatening. Still, life at Hinterkaifeck went on. The farm was isolated, and the family did not immediately abandon it. Maybe they thought the sounds had a normal explanation. Maybe Andreas, being an older farmer and head of the household, did not want to show fear. Maybe the family believed no one would be bold enough to stay hidden on their property. Or maybe they were afraid but did not know what to do. Whatever the reason, they remained there. On the evening of March 30th, 1922, the nightmare finally happened. The killer appears to have used a heavy farming tool, often described as a mattock or pickaxe-like weapon. It was the kind of tool that belonged on a farm, something ordinary and practical. But in the hands of a murderer, it became brutal. The attack was not loud and chaotic in the way people might imagine. It seems to have been controlled, patient, and methodical. The adults were likely lured one by one into the barn. That detail is one of the most chilling parts of the case. The killer did not simply rush into the house and attack everyone at once. Instead, it seems he drew them out separately, perhaps using noises or some kind of trick. One person would go to investigate, then never return. Then another would follow. In a remote farm at night, this would not have seemed impossible. If someone heard a sound from the barn, they might naturally go check on the animals. If another family member noticed they had not come back, they might go after them. And in that way, the killer may have turned the family's own concern and routine against them. Andreas Gruber was killed in the barn. His wife, Cecilia, was killed there too. Victoria Gabriel was also murdered there. 7-year-old Cecilia, the little girl, was attacked as well. Their bodies were later found stacked together and covered with hay, as if the killer wanted to hide what had happened or simply keep the scene controlled. The use of hay makes the crime feel even colder. It was not just murder in a moment of rage. After the attack, the killer took time to cover the bodies. Inside the house, the youngest child, 2-year-old Joseph, was killed in his crib. He was too young to understand any of it. He could not run. He could not defend himself. The idea that the killer went inside and killed a toddler in his own bed makes the case even more horrifying. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was also killed in her room. She had only just arrived at the farm, stepping into a place already marked by danger without knowing anything about it. She may have barely had time to settle in before becoming part of one of the most disturbing, unsolved murders in European history. One of the saddest details is what happened to little Cecilia. She did not die immediately. Evidence suggested she survived for some time after the attack, badly injured and trapped among the dead. In terror and pain, she pulled out clumps of her own hair. That detail has haunted people for decades because it makes the suffering painfully human. It reminds us that this was not just a mystery, not just a famous case, not just a creepy story. These were real people, and one of them was a frightened child who spent her final moments in unimaginable fear. After killing all 6 people, the murderer did something that makes the case even more unsettling. He stayed. He did not immediately run away into the night. He did not vanish right after the killings, as many murderers would. Instead, whoever killed the Gruber family remained at the farm for days. During that time, he appears to have fed the animals, eaten food from the kitchen, and even kept fires going. Smoke was reportedly seen from the chimney after the murders, making outsiders believe the household was still functioning. The animals were cared for enough that no one immediately suspected total disaster. That behavior is deeply disturbing because it suggests the killer was calm after the murders. He was comfortable enough to move around the property, use the kitchen, tend to farm chores, and stay inside a house where 6 bodies were hidden nearby. Most people would not be able to spend even a few minutes in such a place after something so violent. But this person lingered, as if the farm belonged to him. There is something almost ghost-like about that part of the story. From the outside, Hinterkaifeck may have looked normal for a short time. Smoke from the chimney, animals still alive, no obvious sign of panic. But inside, the family was dead, and their killer was walking through their rooms. Neighbors eventually began to notice that something was wrong. The family had not been seen. The little girl did not show up at school. People from the farm missed church. Mail and other signs of daily life began to seem unusual. In a small rural community, absence starts to speak after a while. At first it may seem like nothing. Then it becomes strange. Then it becomes frightening. On April 4th, several days after the murders, people finally went to the farm to check. What they found became one of Germany's most infamous crime scenes. The bodies were discovered, and the horror of what had happened slowly became clear. 6 people had been murdered, including 2 children and a maid who had only recently arrived. The killer was gone. The investigation began, but from the start, the case was difficult. The crime scene had not been protected the way a modern crime scene would be. People moved through the property. Bodies were handled. Evidence was disturbed. Police methods in 1922 were limited compared to what investigators have today. There was no DNA testing, no modern forensics, no surveillance cameras, no phone location data, and no quick way to track a suspect through digital records. Investigators had to rely on interviews, footprints, rumors, motives, and physical clues that could easily be misunderstood or lost. Over the years, many suspects were discussed. Some people believed the killer was someone close to the family. Others thought it may have been a robber, though the fact that valuables were reportedly left behind made robbery seem less likely as the main motive. Some suspected someone with a personal grudge. There were dark rumors surrounding the family, including rumors about Andreas and Victoria, and speculation that little Joseph's parentage may have created conflict. One possible suspect often discussed was a neighbor who may have had connections to Victoria and the child. But no theory has ever been proven beyond doubt. That uncertainty is part of why the Hinterkaifeck case remains so frightening. If the killer had been caught, the story would still be horrifying, but it would have an ending. People could point to one person and say, that was him. There would be some kind of explanation, even if it was ugly. But because the case was never solved, the mystery stays open. The killer walked away from the farm and disappeared into history. He may have returned to ordinary life. He may have stood among neighbors as they talked about the murders. He may have watched the investigation. He may have lived for years afterward without ever paying for what he did. The idea that he could have blended back into society is chilling. What makes Hinterkaifeck feel almost like a real-life horror movie is not only the violence, it is the build-up, the strange footsteps in the attic, the footprints in the snow, the missing tools, the isolated farm, the family hearing things and not knowing what they meant. Then the careful luring of victims to the barn. Then the murders. Then the killer staying afterward, eating their food and caring for their animals while the bodies lay hidden. It has the structure of a nightmare. The setting alone adds to the fear. A lonely farmhouse in early spring with the snow still marking the ground, fields stretching out around it, and the nearest help too far away to matter. In places like that, darkness feels different. A person cannot simply shout and expect someone to come. If someone is hiding nearby, you may not know until it is too late. If something moves above you in the attic, you are alone with that sound. The case also touches on a fear many people have, but rarely say out loud. The fear that someone could secretly enter your life and learn it from the shadows. Not a stranger who attacks suddenly on the road, but someone who watches. Someone who knows them when you sleep. Someone who knows where the children are. Someone who knows the layout of the rooms. Someone close enough to hear you, but hidden enough that you cannot see him. That possibility is what gives the story its lasting power. Even now, more than 100 years later, people still discuss Hinterkaifeck because it feels both old and strangely modern. The weapons, the farm life, and the snow-covered rural setting belong to another era. But the fear itself is timeless. The idea of an intruder inside your home is something anyone can understand. The idea of warnings being ignored until it is too late is something people feel deeply. The idea of a killer staying in the house afterward is almost beyond comprehension. And the final cruelty is that the victims likely spent their last days sensing something was wrong, but not knowing how close danger really was. They heard the noises. They saw the tracks. They noticed things missing. Maybe they told themselves there had to be a normal reason. Maybe they were afraid, but hoped it would pass. Maybe they thought they could handle it because it was their farm, their home, their world. But the threat was already there. By the time anyone outside realized the Gruber family had vanished from daily life, the crime was already done. The fires had burned. The animals had been fed. The killer had eaten, waited, and left. The farm stood quiet again, but now the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of rural life. It was the silence left behind after something monstrous had happened, and no one had been there to stop it. One of the reasons Operation Nemesis fascinates so many people is because it feels like a strange mix of history, espionage thriller, political assassination story, and tragedy all at once. It is rooted in one of the darkest events of the early 20th century, the Armenian Genocide. But the aftermath almost reads like something written for film, except it really happened. The book Operation Nemesis by Eric Bogosian helped introduce a lot of readers to that story in a more emotional and narrative way. Bogosian was already known as an actor and playwright, but while researching his Armenian heritage and the history surrounding the genocide, he became deeply absorbed in what happened after it. From his perspective, the events were so shocking and cinematic that he felt compelled to tell the story in detail rather than simply use it as background material for another project. The Armenian Genocide itself took place during World War I, primarily between 1915 and 1917, under the collapsing Ottoman Empire. Hundreds of thousands, and according to many historians, well over 1 million Armenians, were deported, massacred, starved, or marched to death. Entire communities disappeared. Families were destroyed. Survivors scattered across the world carrying trauma that would echo through generations. For many Armenians, one of the most painful parts was not only the scale of the killing, but the feeling that many of the organizers escaped meaningful punishment afterward. The Ottoman Empire collapsed after the war, and some officials responsible for the genocide fled the country. A few were tried in absentia, but enforcement was weak and chaotic. Europe, after World War I, was unstable. Governments were distracted, and many perpetrators managed to relocate to different countries under false names or with political protection. Some settled into new lives, believing they had survived the collapse of the empire and escaped justice permanently. But among Armenian survivors and activists, another idea was taking shape. A secret operation emerged within the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, also known as the Dashnaksutyun. The mission became known later as Operation Nemesis. Its purpose was direct and ruthless: identify and assassinate major individuals connected to the genocide and related massacres. The name Nemesis itself came from the Greek goddess of retribution. What makes the story so gripping is that the people carrying out these operations were not massive governments with armies and endless resources. Many were survivors, exiles, refugees, or members of a shattered community that had just experienced near destruction. Yet they organized intelligence networks, tracked targets across countries, studied routines, forged documents, gathered information, and carried out targeted assassinations with an effectiveness that shocked observers. One of the most famous operations involved Talat Pasha, one of the principal architects of the genocide, and formerly one of the most powerful men in the Ottoman Empire. After the war, he fled to Berlin and lived there under a different identity, believing distance and politics would protect him. But Armenian operatives found him. In 1921, an Armenian survivor named Soghomon Tehlirian approached Talat on a Berlin street and shot him dead in broad daylight. The assassination became internationally famous, especially because the later trial turned into something much larger than a murder case. During the proceedings, the genocide itself was dragged into public discussion. Tellerian's defense argued that he was psychologically shattered by witnessing the destruction of his family and people. In the end, the jury acquitted him. That moment sent shockwaves through many political circles. For Armenians, Tellerian became a symbol of vengeance and survival. For former Ottoman officials hiding abroad, it became a terrifying warning, because it did not stop with Talayat. Other figures connected to massacres and deportations were tracked down across Europe and Central Asia. Some were shot in streets, others were ambushed unexpectedly. The operation spread fear precisely because it was patient. Targets realized that years passing did not necessarily mean safety. Time itself became part of the psychological pressure. That lingering dread is one of the most haunting aspects of the story. Imagine once being a powerful wartime official surrounded by authority, soldiers, and influence. Then suddenly, the empire collapses. Allies disappear. You flee into exile. At first, maybe you feel relief. You convince yourself the world has moved on. You start living under another name. You read newspapers nervously, but try to rebuild some sense of normal life. Then you hear that someone else from the old regime has been killed. Then another, and gradually the realization sets in that somebody is hunting people connected to the genocide one by one. That psychological terror became part of Operation Nemesis's power. It was not just about killing individuals. It was about destroying the sense of invulnerability many former officials once possessed. Some reportedly became deeply paranoid, moving frequently, avoiding routines, distrusting strangers, and living with constant fear that someone might recognize them. The image almost feels cinematic because the emotional reversal is so dramatic. Men who once commanded deportations and death marches suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders in foreign cities, uncertain if every approaching stranger might be an assassin. According to many accounts, Armenian operatives became highly skilled at surveillance and intelligence gathering. They studied habits carefully. They blended into cities. They monitored movements patiently. Some historians and writers have argued that the operation demonstrated methods later echoed in modern intelligence and covert operations, though that influence can sometimes be overstated in popular retellings. Still, the effectiveness of the campaign undeniably impressed observers. What makes the story emotionally powerful for many readers is the sense that a nearly annihilated people refuse to disappear quietly. Survivors of genocides are often portrayed only through suffering, grief, and victimhood. Operation Nemesis complicated that image. Here were survivors who organized globally, pursued accountability personally, and refused to accept that mass murderers should simply retire peacefully into exile. At the same time, the story also forces difficult moral questions. Political assassination is still assassination. Some people view Operation Nemesis as justified vengeance in a world where formal justice failed completely. Others are uncomfortable with the idea of individuals taking justice into their own hands, regardless of the circumstances. That moral tension is part of why the story remains so debated and compelling. The historical backdrop also matters enormously. After World War I, international systems for prosecuting crimes against humanity barely existed in the form people recognize today. There was no international criminal court, no developed global framework for genocide prosecution. The word genocide itself did not even exist yet. Many survivors genuinely believed nobody else would ever punish the perpetrators, and in many cases they were probably right. That sense of abandonment fueled the emotional force behind Nemesis. For survivors, this was not merely revenge for personal pain. It was a response to the terrifying idea that mass murder on a gigantic scale could happen, and the world would ultimately allow the organizers to escape. The story also gained mythic status, partly because of how effective some operations seemed. Once enough assassinations occurred, fear itself became a weapon. Former officials could never fully know how much information Armenian networks possessed or how close operatives might already be. That uncertainty amplified the terror far beyond the actual number of assassinations. Bogosian's telling of the story resonates because he focuses not only on politics and operations, but on emotion and memory. He writes from the perspective of someone who grew up hearing fragments of inherited trauma, then gradually realized the scale and complexity behind those stories. For many descendants of genocide survivors, history is not abstract. It exists in family silence, grief, photographs, stories interrupted halfway through, and names of relatives who vanished. Operation Nemesis becomes powerful partly because it transforms that inherited grief into action and narrative momentum. There is also something deeply unsettling about the historical timing. Many of the men targeted by Nemesis had once believed themselves untouchable because they operated within state systems. They were officials, commanders, ministers, bureaucrats. They used government power to carry out horrific policies while surrounded by legal authority and military structures. But after the empire fell apart, those structures vanished. Suddenly, they were just isolated men in foreign countries carrying terrible secrets and hoping history would forget them. And history did not forget. That does not mean every aspect of the story should be romanticized. Real violence leaves real consequences. Some operations involved innocent bystanders being endangered. Some historical details remain debated or dramatized over time. And like many stories connected to trauma and revenge, there is always a danger of reducing complex suffering into something that feels too much like entertainment. Still, it is understandable why the story leaves such a strong impression on people. It combines genuine historical horror with the structure of a relentless pursuit thriller. The emotional reversal is striking. Survivors scattered and traumatized after genocide, gradually reorganizing themselves into a covert network capable of reaching powerful men across continents. The hunted becoming the hunters. And maybe the most haunting part is the atmosphere surrounding those former officials in exile. The idea of men who once exercised enormous power, spending years trapped in quiet paranoia, is psychologically gripping. Every newspaper headline becomes terrifying. Every unfamiliar face on the street becomes suspicious. Every assassination elsewhere becomes another reminder that the past is not buried. For them, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire did not end the story. It only began the countdown.
So that's where we'll stop tonight. Before you go, remember this. Every story you just heard was real. Real people, real nights, and none of them saw it coming. If that got to you the way it gets to most people, do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe. I post new stories all the time, and I don't want you to miss them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.